Yo, yo, it's time to discover the flow. Shout out to the bros. You know, I like to welcome everybody to discover the flow. No matter how you discover the show or discover the bros, now you about to see how far we can go, because it's time for discover the flow. Yeah, cowabunga do. You know live is how we come to you. Turn the levels up when you hear the boys coming through. The Pod Squad giving you just what you need, hitting you with a new special guest every week. Don't you dare hit skip, man, it's Tristan and Kip. DTF Pod about to take you on a trip. Mega Ran bring the heat, yeah. But be clear, I wasn't even supposed to be here. Welcome to Discover the Flow. No matter how you discovered the show or discovered the bros, now you about to see how far we can go, because it's time for Discover the Flow. Let's start the show.
And I said, you know what? You guys understand something that I guess I get as part of what I do is work, which is persistence. So if I'm after somebody to try to get an interview, I'm doing something on a book or whatever, and they say no, they don't answer, they're busy, you know, I just sort of keep nudging them along. And
well, when you really want to talk to somebody and learn stuff from them, you have to be persistent. You have to talk to them. You have to keep on people, because we're all busy. We're all busy people.
Yeah.
So
no, you get it, and thank you very, very much for having patience.
I don't want to make you not feel special or anything, but like there are a few others that we have actually waited longer. You know, I don't know if you know who Kevin Smith is, but we were promised almost a year ago now an interview with him, and we're still waiting on that one.
So, and you know, I mean, okay, so Kevin Smith's different, but I mean, for guys like me who are freelancers, it's feast or famine. So it's either really a crazy period, in which case, like this has been, everything's going on, or otherwise you're sitting around just like twiddling your thumbs and wondering if you're going to get a call from anybody. So you guys caught a busy period, but thank you for putting up with it.
Well, yeah, and everything that went on just in that time frame, there was, you know, the new pope being elected, and just there was so much.
Or as we referred to him out here, the Pope.
No, we do not refer to him as the Pope.
He might
in the Chicagoland area. We do.
Right. Yeah. Sure. I mean, that was the original question. White Sox or
how
Cubs
was
fan?
that experience for you?
The of the new pope?
Yeah, because you were there for covering.
No, I didn't go over. So I watched it from here because you know, the same thing, and you'll understand this. You reach out to different news organizations and say, hey, you need a stringer over there. You need somebody to sort of, you know, do it from Rome, because you're hoping you'll find somebody to pick up the ticket at the very least. No, in a day and age in which news organizations have cut back, if anything, on expenses, they'll use you know, the one reporter they have in Italy or Spain or France to head over to Rome and cover it instead of sending in somebody else. So I didn't get over there, but I followed it. I was in touch every day with people I knew that I interviewed extensively for the book on the finances of the Vatican. And as is always, the most amazing thing, you know, you guys would love this because you're running a podcast and you understand the power of it. Yeah, I would have loved to have just, if they had allowed it, to turn on a microphone and just record the rumor mill in the period from the death of the Pope to the election of the new one, just in those couple of days, because there are few things better than what I call the Vatican rumor mill. You know, you've got hundreds and hundreds of guys, and they're all guys. There are some women in what I call the bureaucracy positions in Vatican City, but otherwise they're all guys who, for the most part, have sworn an oath of celibacy, and they're running the church, and they're also running this little sovereign state called the Vatican at the same time. They're living together, and with everybody that you live together with, family, friends, together with people you work with, There are times you love them and times you hate them. So they get all of those things are working together. And then the rumor mill starts up about who's leading the charge to become the next pope and what's behind it and who the powers are. And it's fantastic, fantastic sort of what I call a deep dive into the, at times, most paranoid feelings inside Vatican City. But, in the end, the new pope gets elected and then everybody gets on board for the most part.
Yeah, and the gentleman that was chosen, he wasn't even in the rumor mills that were going around. I think one of the biggest rumors was a Brazilian gentleman,
Yeah,
or another one from South Africa.
right.
There was a couple of different ones. But the guy from Chicago wasn't even on the list of what people were talking about.
Yeah, it's so great because I have to tell you that I would like to be able to say to you, gee, I know it so well over there. That was my prediction. In fact, it's just the opposite. I was wrong. I said early on, I think publicly, the one thing I said, I don't know who's going to be the next pope, but I'll tell you the one that won't be the next pope is an American. Shows you how much I know. Because I said, and the feeling I was getting from talking to the people inside the Vatican was there's this general feeling that the U.S., especially the U.S. under a Trump administration, is throwing its weight around too much. Then on top of that, the Catholic Church in the U.S., the Cardinal Spellmans of that, the big cardinals in New York, the cardinals in Philadelphia and other places over the years, have used the power that they have and that they raise so much money for the church. The American Catholics contribute more than anybody else. And the cardinals, American cardinals, never let the Italian cardinals and others in Rome forget that. Okay. So they all sort of bristle at that. They're aggravated at the Americans. The Americans, are the last thing they want is an American pope at a time when America's throwing its weight all around. And it goes to show you I was completely wrong. Now, they didn't pick a fellow who is that type of, I'm going to get in your face and tell you I'm an American. They picked somebody who's sort of still there. But it's a remarkable achievement because there was a feeling that they were going to go for what I call it's not a DEI choice.
Nope, you muted yourself.
I was about to ask too. I was like, if you have any kids, let them figure it out. They're super.
Yeah, right. No, exactly. That's what we're missing. We don't have any kids, and so I always say to Tricia, a 14-year-old. We have a 14-year-old and a 16-year-old god kids. We need to get one of them. They can fix it in 2 seconds. But I must say that that's the first time I've lost it. So I have, it's technology. Sometimes you might have trouble. The mic's not, something's wrong. That's the first time I actually lost it in the middle of a sentence with everything being the same and not being a connectivity problem.
What it looked like was that something got clicked there because you can mute your own mic, and it looked like that mic button may have gotten clicked or something.
Yeah, or that but the great thing is, and then I switched to another mic and that didn't work. So the thing is, you would imagine if you were a religious guy that it's divine intervention, meaning we're talking about the Pope, the Vatican, the insiders, what they really think about the next Pope. I'm telling you that there was talk about ticking the box. And what I mean by ticking the box in the Vatican before we sort of got divinely intervened on was the idea that the church could benefit from. This is a sort of a cold calculus. I know that everybody's supposed to go into the into the actual conclave, and you wait for the Holy Spirit, is the way we were taught when we were kids in Catholic school, to come down and it'll tell the cardinals who to choose. That aside, if you're also looking at it from what's the best interest of the church, a number of the cardinals realize that the biggest growth that the church has had in the past 10 and 15 years is in sort of developing countries. In Latin America, South America, across Africa, across Asia, they're losing numbers or real followers in Europe and the United States and Canada. It's a tougher thing. So is it time, some of them are asking, for the church to be led by someone from Africa or somebody from the Philippines? Should we have an Asian pope for the first time? Remember, it's hard to imagine that until you got Benedict elected, the German Pope. That was the first time you didn't have an Italian Pope in a long time.
Who was
for
who was
150
so
years.
popular.
Right. That was it. And then after Benedict, right, so popular. And so then they say, okay, we can't go to Germany again for a Pope. Oh my God. Imagine if Peter had built the church on a rock in Munich instead of in Rome. It would have been such a different church. So less chaotic, but not as much fun. And it seems to me that you then get Francis, who is Argentinian. And although you can't tell the Argentines that they are from South America because they all think they're Italian, but at least you had a South American Pope, and that made a difference. So the question here is, were they going to go to Asia or Africa? And not only did they not do that, the Italians, by the way, for whatever it's worth, Francis had made it almost impossible for the Italians on their own to reclaim the papacy in a bloc, because they used to have a majority of the cardinals. Now they're down to a small number. Even when they had a majority, they fought among themselves as to which one should be pope. So they never really voted as a bloc. But if they did vote as a bloc, and they would have loved to have retaken the papacy. A lot of the bureaucracy in the Curia is Italian still, and so they would have liked to have had it returned to Italian. But it goes back to my first statement. I did not think an American would be Pope. So it goes to show I've learned again humility. Never try to predict what the cardinals will do. Just like you shouldn't predict what a jury will do, don't try to predict what a conclave will do on picking the next Pope.
I'm really curious about something. You were raised Catholic yourself, right?
Right.
Has that helped or hurt your work on the Vatican?
Oh, it was a tremendous help in the sense that not in terms, I didn't have an inside advantage, and you could do a book on the finances of the Vatican if you're Lutheran or Jewish or an atheist or whatever else. But having been raised Catholic, I call myself now a cultural Catholic. I understand the church in a way. I understand the way that people think about it. And I say in the beginning of the book, boy, this is not a book about faith. This is not a book about religion. I'm not arguing whether this is the true and only faith or whether it's not. But I know growing up in grammar school, when I had the Sisters of Charity and going on to high school and had Jesuits, that I thought as a kid, and all of my Catholic friends thought of it only as a religion. We were raised to, think you had the gift of faith, and that when I met my wife, and we've been together 45 years, and she's Jewish. I remember that, I took her into St. Patrick's so that we would go along. I introduced her to all the saints along the way, and introduced her to, as we went down that thing, to St. Jude. And I said, by the way, St. Jude, he's the saint of like lost causes. If everybody else you've appealed to in your prayers doesn't answer, then you sort of pray to St. Jude. And she said what only somebody outside of the church or faith would think of. She said, well, then why don't you go to St. Jude first? If he's the one with the magic powers that can really get anything done, if everybody else has failed you, why don't you just go to St. Jude? And I said, nah, it's not fair. It doesn't work that way. That's not it. Then as we were together, we would be in towns, we would visit someplace. And this is still at a time when I was going to church. Now I'm a Catholic, but I'm no longer a weekly parishioner. And she would say, do you want to stop in and like say a prayer or whatever? And I'd say, oh no, Trish, that's not a real church. That's a Lutheran church or Episcopalian church or something like that. Because as Catholics, you're raised to believe that is either Catholic or that's it. So I think that coming into that was great, but I never thought as a kid in all those times or growing up in the faith that it was also country. Just wasn't on my radar. So I didn't think of it as a place that could have a flag at the United Nations if it wanted to, that it had the equivalent of a Secretary of State, that it made policy regarding those. And so that the fascination to me as an investigative journalist, as a historian, was to say, you know what? This is unique. It's not just unique because it is a church and a sovereign entity, but the very same men who run the church in senior positions as cardinals also cross over and wear a different hat in the sovereign area and make decisions regarding the sovereign entity. They sort of have a foot in both worlds, and it's also then why the finances get screwed up, because they don't know finances that well. It's often not bad intent. That's not their strength. So I think the long answer to your question, I think it was a help to understand the church the way I did, and I will stick to that.
You talk about the Vatican itself being a country. I'm almost ashamed of how old I was when I first learned that. It's small though. It's 110 acres. There's about 1,000 people. It's technically the world's smallest country, but if you think about it, the money that they bring in from donations and investments and just sales from shills that they have and private enterprises, it's around 350 million yearly, but they're rumored to have about 75 billion in assets. And I mean, there's a lot of countries that don't even have half that.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And I think, well, so the amazing thing is, I mean, if we think of it in terms of history, there was a time, we now talk about it, and you're right, Tristan, it being a postage size stamp, parcel in the heart of Rome. That's its sovereign territory. But there was a time it was a real kingdom, when it had the papal states. In the Middle Ages, popes were the equivalent of secular kings. They had large swath of Italian territory that they governed, with lots of people there and they were supported. The church was supported the way that all of the monarchs who had large territories and kingdoms back in the Middle Ages would do it. They would levy taxes and collect fees, and they kept the church running. Aside from the extra money that was taken in from things like indulgences, the payment of to forgive sins and things like that. But really, it ran as a kingdom. And it was only when Italy unified in the late 1800s that it's to the detriment of the Vatican, because they lose that kingdom in the unification of Italy, and they're left with this little parcel of land in the heart of Rome as Vatican City, and they lose their sovereignty. So now the Pope is just the head of the church, and the Vatican has no say or right as a country or nation on its own. And the Pope, to protest that, initially went ahead and declared himself a prisoner in Vatican City, never left Vatican City. And that was a great fundraising idea, because Catholics around the world supported the Pope by sending in large amounts of money to sort of say, we're behind you. But it took Mussolini and the Italian fascist government to strike a deal with the Vatican that gave them back their sovereignty, even though it didn't add anything to their land. So it said, that little parcel of land that you're on, you've had since unification of Italy, we're going to say you're a sovereign state again. And the reason that happens in this deal that takes place, the Lateran Pact, as it's called, between the church and Mussolini, isn't because either side liked each other. Mussolini didn't like the church at all. He had called the priests black microbes, or infecting the society, or that. But he also knew that at the time that he had come to power, before World War II, that 98% of Italians considered themselves Catholics. The Catholic faith had real impact. Priests from their pulpits every Sunday could move the population. And as a result, he wanted to strike a deal with the Vatican. The Vatican was afraid that he wasn't religious enough. They weren't too sure about his movement, but they decided it was better to hit this deal with him. And what they got in return was they got some money for having lost the papal states in the 1870s, the equivalent of like $1 billion today. And they got the right to be sovereign. And that was absolutely critical. So going forward, they had that. And then the part that I like so much, and I say like not in terms of admiration, but in terms of the history, is the serendipity of World War II comes in, and here's the Vatican declaring itself neutral. All right. The problem with that is if you are looking at this, at what's happening in the Vatican, over 96 and 97% of the cardinals at the time are Italian. And most of those cardinals did not come from dirt poor families. They came from well-to-do Italian families that had 4 or 5 children. And the mother and father would say, one of my sons is an admiral in the Italian Navy, and one is a military officer, and one is a commander in the police, and one is a cardinal in the Vatican. It was that type of situation. You'd have great family reunions. So the people in the Vatican who were running the church were Italian. They had brothers and sisters and family on the other side of the wall in Italy who were fighting for the Italian nation in World War II. It's almost impossible for them to be neutral, but that's what they claimed they were. So they claimed neutrality. Now, the Americans and the British had a program called the Blacklist, in which they tried really hard to find countries, especially neutral countries, that were doing business with the Axis powers, with the Germans and the Italians. And over a period of a couple of years, the American Treasury Department put on a so-called blacklist Switzerland, Liechtenstein, San Marino. You talk about tiny countries. Monaco. They all get blacklisted for doing business with the Germans or Italians. The only one that doesn't is the Vatican. Now, in part, if you were cynical, you'd say that's because Franklin Roosevelt knew there were a lot of Catholic voters in the United States and didn't want to anger them by putting the Pope and the Vatican on the blacklist. That's partially true, but the part that's
so it was more of a decision of optics than anything.
That's right. So I would tend to think there weren't many people from San Marino that were going to change the election, but Italians in America could have made a difference. But the key is the Vatican was aware of this, and they, in 1942, in the middle of the war, create the Vatican Bank. So we've heard about the Vatican Bank in different times. Godfather 3 has the Vatican Bank at the heart of, it's a storyline and things like this, but no one knows where it starts. So it doesn't start in the 1800s. It doesn't start the early 1900s or in 1970. It starts in the middle of World War II, and not by accident. It starts because the Vatican knows that the Americans and the British are able to track their financial movements and transfers through the international banking system so long as they rely on Italy's central bank. So by creating the Vatican Bank, it was a hodgepodge between a central bank, like the American Central Bank, and what I think of as sort of quasi-investment bank, like Goldman Sachs or something like that. But it allowed the Vatican's financial transactions to go off the radar. They ran them through the Vatican Bank as opposed to running them through the Italian banks and others, which were monitored by the Americans and British. And the Americans, I looked through the archives of the World War II archives of the cables between the Treasury Department and the people who are trying to find out if the Vatican is dealing with the Germans or Italians. And you keep hearing they've gone black. We can't see. We can't see in because the Vatican Bank is sort of this buffer. It's like a VPN in between the Vatican and the financial transactions. Now, what I found in doing the book, which I think was my biggest get, was that, and it's not a surprise, it shouldn't be a surprise if you realize that they were so aligned with Italy, they invested in World War II into America. They bought American stocks, US Steel, other things. They invested into Britain. They bought property in central London. It's still worth, they still have some of its days worth of fortune. And they bought stocks, shares in German and Italian insurance companies. All right. And those insurance companies like Allianz and Generali, late in the war, said, hey, this had nothing to do with the Vatican. This is the insurance companies. Hey, we have these policies on life insurance policies in Eastern Europe for these Jews, and they're all like being sent to death camps. So the cash value of those policies, we can take that cash value off now, and their profits zoomed. So as a result, the Vatican earned really, really good outsized profits. After the war, the Vatican said, hey, we were neutral. We only invested in the winning side. We invested in the Americans and the British. We never invested in those losers, the Italians and the Germans. And everybody's believed that. And I will tell you that, think about this just in terms of common sense. Common sense may be at a scarcity sometimes, but in terms of common sense, it would make
It's at an all-time low in the U.S., so don't feel bad.
all-time low. So I'm hoping this scrapes some of those who still use it. If you're the Vatican and your main interest is the preservation of the church, and there's a war going on, and you intend to invest in, you're not going to really just pick one side. You are going to invest in all sides because you don't know who's going to win. And it makes sense that until the Allies start to win, the Vatican doesn't roll back its investments in the German and Italian insurance companies until early 44. Then you start to see, you know, the Allies have landed in June, right? They're coming up from North Africa into Sicily. And then the people in the church are saying, you know what, I think we can hedge our bets more on the Allied side. But in the beginning, they're covering both their bases. And afterwards, they were able to say, we're sovereign and got away with it. But that's only because of the Vatican Bank. Without the Vatican Bank, they could never have done that.
Well, and anyone that knows anything about finance will tell you diversification is success.
Yeah,
because
exactly. And they were diversifying. I will say that, you know, the one sidelight on the Vatican Bank, which I liked, is that when it was created, it had only one shareholder, the Pope. It only takes instructions from the Pope. It has no board of directors or anything else. So if the Pope signs off on it, it's still good. And it's the Vatican Bank that over the post-war period becomes sort of the financial black eye for the Vatican, because the people running it are getting involved with, not always, but bankers that are unscrupulous, bankers that ended up using the Vatican Bank to run mafia money through, to do offshore deals for the equivalent of Ponzi schemes, because the worst of the financiers, the Bernie Madoffs of Italy, these guys like Roberto Calvi and Nicola Sandona, they realized that if they could be known as God's banker, the banker chosen by the Pope to be the outside advisor to the Vatican Bank, that gave them tremendous clout on every business deal they did. Because if they went in to do a business deal somewhere and somebody said, so who the backers? And these guys would say, well, I've got the Bank of Italy, and I've got 3 industrialists, and I've got 4 people from Milan, and I've got the Vatican. The Vatican was the sure bet that everybody thought it was all kosher. Everything was above board. Nothing could go wrong. If you got the Vatican involved, it has to be, you know, absolutely perfect. And often that was just used as a foil because the people inside the Vatican, the cardinals and that, weren't really aware of the extent to which the bank was getting gamed.
So, is there a difference between the Institute for Works of Religion and the Vatican Bank, or is it just another name for the same thing?
Same thing. Institutes Works of Religion is the name for the Vatican Bank. It's a only inside the Vatican could you take a bank that really is as obtuse and at least transparent, one of the least transparent banks on the international scene, and covered with the good name of Institute of of Religious Works or that. And I think, look, there's no doubt that there's a great period in the 60s in which a new pope had come into place, Pope Paul VI. And he's the one who does Vatican II and sort of leads all the efforts in reforming the church. And he picked a person who was an American. We have an American pope, so we're going back to an American head of the Vatican Bank, this guy called Paul Marcinkus, who was then just a priest, later became a Monsignor from Chicago, from Cicero, Illinois. And he's like a 6'4" tough, loud mouth, wonderful, cigar smoking American who had a large car. He would take tourists around Vatican City. He would take care of the Pope. He was his unofficial bodyguard when they would travel. At one point in the Philippines, he sort of pushed himself forward when somebody seemed to lean at the Pope with a knife. He's a real tough guy. And the Pope thought, you know what? He'd be perfect to run the Vatican Bank. Why? Because the Pope wanted somebody who was loyal. And Marcinkus says, this is fantastic. So how hard can it be? I love somebody who has enough self-confidence they think they can do anything. He said, I went out and bought some books on finances. I took a course on like running a financial institution. You can't even really find any evidence of that, but let's assume he bought the books. And he became this garrulous sort of, take charge head of the bank who was taken advantage of in many ways and allowed himself to be by these outside bankers who were very clever in looking for things. But he also used the bank in its dark format for things that many people would still say, "Oh, I like that." And what I mean by that is, after Paul VI, we get the great era of the first non-Italian pope, the Polish pope. We get that era in which we find that we have a pope in place who comes into power in the late 70s, 78, not just before Ronald Reagan becomes president. It's the middle of the Cold War, and Margaret Thatcher takes over in England. And I think that Pope John II, he was a real cold warrior. The CIA knew that, the Americans knew that, and they met with him early on. And they said, how can the church be of help to us? And they knew that the church could be of help because in 1948, right after World War II, it was the Catholic Church that helped rally Italian voters to defeat a socialist communist government candidate who was leading in the polls to take over Italy. Italy almost went red after the war. It stayed out of going red because the church sort of rallied and got money from the CIA and pushed for conservative candidates. Now you get the Polish Pope who says, we'll help you out. And they did. Marcinkus at the Vatican Bank arranged for the CIA to send money to Solidarity, which was the union in Poland, led by Lech Walesa, that was fighting and standing against the Soviets. There's an incident I describe in the book in which they send a small car filled with gold ingots, like $1.4 million, and travels over to Poland. So the Vatican is doing all of these things to help bring down communism, which they've always hated because that's the true threat to the church, because they're equal opportunity atheists, right? They'll never have any room for religion. And with a Polish Pope who really understands it, because his country is under the yoke at that time of the Soviet Union as a communist satellite, he's able to use the Vatican Bank and the Vatican secrecy and lack of transparency to help Reagan and the CIA, and they play a real role in helping to destabilize the Soviet Union, Eastern Europe, and they deserve credit for that. They don't deserve credit for all the deals with the mafia and the hiding of Italian wealthy money for those who want to avoid taxes and things like that. But it's a good and bad situation, to say the least.
Now, is there a conspiracy theory involving John Paul I about being murdered because of this?
Yes, absolutely. As a matter of fact, I'm sorry I skipped over the 33-day papacy of John Paul I, because you're right. It doesn't go just from Pope, Paul VI to the all of a sudden we have the election of the Polish cardinal. We get an Italian Pope, and that Pope, who takes the name Pope John Paul, he is no friend of Marcinkus, the person who's running the Vatican Bank. He thinks there's probably time for a cleanup. And I believe, from having done all my research on this, that if he had lived, he would have replaced Marcinkus at the head of the bank, because he didn't like Marcinkus. He thought Marcinkus wasn't following the rules enough. He wanted his own people in charge. So Marcinkus's days were numbered. Marcinkus had a meeting with him. It didn't go that well. And then the next thing you know, the Pope is dead. And in a place where somehow the word transparency never got brought over from the Italian into Vatican City. It just doesn't exist. This is an institution, and I get it. This is an institution that has survived for 2,000 years. And it has survived Hitler, it survived the Nazis, it survived, the Mongols coming into to Europe, it survived the fall of the Roman Empire. And its view is that if it just keeps doing what it's doing, it doesn't have to answer things publicly. Whatever the scandal is of the moment, it will go away. And eventually people will forget and they'll be able to go on to the next thing. They have a long memory. It has an institutional memory. So when this Pope died, instead of disclosing the information of what was around it. They hid it, and eventually they don't realize it's the modern era. Things come out. And what do I mean by that? Every morning, a nun would bring him his breakfast and leave it on a tray in front of the door in this month that he was alive. She did it that morning that he was found dead. And she comes back to collect the tray later in the morning, and it's still not taken in. Normally opens the door at some point, takes the tray in, and that's the end of it. So she instead opens the door and goes in, and there he is, papers falling on the floor. He's in the bed, looking to her as though he's not moving, and she immediately runs out to summon help. The idea, the cardinals, the Secretary of State, who were brought in almost immediately to do damage control on top of figuring out what had happened with the Pope, said, "Oh my God, we can't say that a nun was in the Pope's bedroom and found him dead, that the first person in the room was a woman who happens to have herself a habit. Were they doing something? The public might think that, or the public might think something was untoward. Why did she have access?" Instead of saying what happened to the Pope, the question was, why did she have access to the bedroom without anybody else having to let her in? How was that discovered? And then they have this debate in the cardinals. So they've never done an autopsy on a Pope. They, autopsies weren't around. They just sort of buried them. That was the end of it. But they have a discussion. Gee, his doctor says he has a history of heart disease, but nobody expected him to die right away. Maybe an autopsy should be done to dispel any notion that he's been poisoned as prior popes were in the 1600s, or killed as popes were in the 1300s. And they decide not to. No autopsy. We're not going to do it. So that immediately doubles down on all the suspicions about what happened. The next pope who comes in, the Polish cardinal, happens to be the exact opposite, 180 degrees on Marcinkus and the bank. He loves Marcinkus. He says, "I'm going to give you a green light to keep doing what you're doing and even have more leeway." So if you're looking at this from a conspiracy viewpoint, Kip, you could put all those things together. You could say, gee, this Pope comes in, he's going to crack down on the big money outlet, the Vatican Bank, which is doing all these deals with these offshore banks and Italian bankers and everything else. He's going to throw Marcinkus out. And then the powers that be, the big money people, they came forward and they said, hey, we've got to get rid of the Pope. He's no good. They do it. And the Vatican isn't even it's not that it's a willing agent in the cover-up. Those who are killing him expect the Vatican to do what they do, which is not disclose anything and hide it all. And therefore they'll be fine. Now, I looked into it, and I must tell you that sort of bit by bit, I wish I could say to you that he was murdered only because it'd be a much bigger story. There was a book put out in the 80s that said he was murdered. I think it sold 6 million copies. So it's astonishing. But when you go through each and every aspect of it, you really do come to the conclusion that this was a natural death that the Vatican made into more of a conspiracy than it had to be because of the way that they acted afterwards. And the real blame is to be on the Vatican. In the end, there isn't a conspiracy there of a murdered Pope, but I understand why people who haven't studied it believe that at first glance.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you said something earlier when you mentioned Pope John and then John Paul. I think I've come up with a new way for the church to have another revenue stream. If we could have John Paul George and then John Paul George Ringo, they could top in the charts.
That would be fantastic. It would be a very good way to have some money raised. Although I have to tell you,
most popular Pope of all time, possibly.
Look, it would be top of the rung, and the popularity. By the way, you will both understand this, that the church still takes a lot of money in from donations, and when a Pope is popular, more donations come in. So if you look at the difference in terms of donation income between the time that Benedict was Pope and Francis was Pope, Benedict was Pope, donations are like here. Looks like a bad slide. You're bouncing along near the bottom. Francis comes in. Whether you like Francis, didn't like Francis, he was popular. He was charismatic. People thought he was fresh. Donations go up like this. So the popularity of a Pope plays a big difference. No question about it.
I did notice that there was a bit of a shift when he came in, where it felt fresh and new, and I don't want to say he felt younger, but it was kind of like when Obama was elected, and everybody was like, "Oh, he's kind of cooler, he's hip, he's more accepting, he's got a feel for his thumb on the pulse of the country and of the planet at the moment." You know what I mean?
Right. No, I think that's absolutely right. And as a matter of fact, so Francis was politically much more attuned, savvy, and sophisticated than his predecessor, than almost any pope in modern times. And
He's more accepting of combining church and science as well.
That's right. No question about it. And he also knew what to answer when asked a question. So, for instance, early on, he was asked about gays in the church. And he said, "Who am I to judge?" Now, that's a classic. He gives you a question to the answer, but then everybody interprets it. The legacy media jumped on that as a sign of openness. They said, "My God, look at this, a major shift inside the church on the questions of gays inside the church." He hadn't actually shifted the policy, but he gave a question that was like, and he was very good at doing that time and time again. On many dogma issues, he didn't change, but he seemed more open.
So you said he gave a perception of a shift.
And he allowed others to interpret it as they wanted to. Now, that was to the anger of the hardcore conservatives, because even though he wasn't changing policy per se, the fact that he opened the door to that discussion and those changes, they would say he just slammed the door. So he set the hair on fire time and time again of what I call the real hardcore conservatives. But he knew what to do. Now, in the beginning, when he first came in, I published the book on the Vatican finance in 2015. He had become Pope in 2014. My book is a snapshot of what people inside the church thought then and what the hierarchy did. And everybody was hopeful that he was going to be the real deal in cleaning up Vatican finances, because they were such a quagmire and such a mess for so long. I think at the end, he did a lot of good. And he put in an institution that is much fresher than it was before. But in the end, the curia, the bureaucracy, the people who sort of slow walked him, rope-a-doped him along the way, made sure he couldn't get everything done. So he got a lot done, but not everything in terms of the finances.
So where does Leo fit into this now? If he is now the Pope, obviously it's Pope Leo. And I mean, I know it's been a very short period of time since he was elected Pope, but where does he fit in this grand scheme of reform, fixing things? Like, what are his policies, I guess?
Yeah. Or at the very least, where do you think he'll fit in?
So the great thing is we don't know yet, because he hasn't laid out a clear policy. He hasn't done, remember what, in the 90s, the Republicans, Newt Gingrich, they issued a contract with America. Remember, they sort of said, this is what we're going to do. Whether you believe that or not, they at least had on paper what they said they were going to do. Mm-hmm. It would be great if Pope Leo said, here's my contract with the church. Here's what I'm going to do. Now, whether he did that or not would be different, but we're not going to get that from him. And he's
plus he's also still in what we normally talk about in the presidency is like your first 100 days.
That's right.
You know?
So Tristan, you just hit the nail on the head, because I think he's on what I call the equivalent of what American politicians would call a listening tour. He's going around to different places. He's hosting, as we talk this weekend, the big, youth Catholic movement, 1.5 million in Rome. He's paying attention to the people who are in the positions of power as cardinals in developing countries in Africa and Asia, seeing what's important to them. He's talking to the American church. He's trying to get a feel without causing any division inside Vatican City among those who have worked for the church for a long time. And I think he is young enough, as far as popes go. He is the first pope. I knew I'd live long enough to say this one day. It's the first time I've had a pope elected younger than me. I think he's a year younger than me. So there you go. You live long enough, and they finally start electing popes younger than you are, and you really know you're getting old. But he is young enough two, I think have a real effect on the church going forward. And he does have, although he spent a lot of time outside of America, his DNA is American. And that may be to the benefit of the church in that he will bring those concepts of transparency and change. He's not burdened by any scandals here. He comes in very clean. He doesn't automatically have an entire group of cardinals dead set against him who want him to fail. Everybody is pulling for him to succeed because at this moment, they all think he's their guy, meaning the conservatives think he's their guy and the liberals think he's their guy. They're not quite sure. At some point, he's going to have to stake out the positions where he loses somebody a little bit here or there, but that's the nature of being Pope.
That's American politics to a T.
It is, but you know, the great thing is, but the difference is in American politics, though, that, okay, so the great difference on the church, a few of them, just a handful. I mean, the president gets elected, and then you think in the first term, whatever president's in power, they're worried about getting elected for the second term. Then they get elected in the second term, and you think, oh, if you were just down from another planet and they explain the American political system to you, you would say, oh, then in the second term, they do whatever they really want. And you say, no, 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 because they're worried about their party getting elected in the next election, and they're raising money for the party. So they're still sort of hedging to like not do everything that they may want to do. The great thing about being elected Pope is that you're Pope for life, unless you do a Benedict and leave before the end of life, but you're there until the end. And it's a non-hereditary monarchy, meaning that you don't get to become Pope based upon a relation to the last Pope. You get elected. But once you're elected, you are the equivalent of a king or real monarch. You have as much power as the royal family in Saudi Arabia, or the royals in the Emirates or wherever else. Your word is the final word. What you say, there's no legislative body. There's no court system to overrule you. There's a curia that can fight you, but it is your word. And that power is supreme inside the church. Now, popes don't often like to use it. They don't like to run things that run counter to the rest of the church, but it's a remarkable position. They don't have to do the politicking that American politicians and Western European politicians and others have to.
See, that raises a question for me. The Holy See, I learned in my research, is the government of the Catholic Church with the Pope at the head. What are exactly his powers? Like who has say over every, like, is he the only one? You say there's no real governmenting body, but like, how does that all work?
Well, you're right. There is a government that functions. There is the equivalent of a Secretary of State, right? They're called Secretary of State. There's the equivalent of a Foreign Office, our State Department. They operate, they create policy. The Pope signs off on them, not with an auto pen, but with a real pen. And it says this is it and puts it into play. Now, the thing is, the Pope can, if the Pope wants to, have the final word, can veto what the policy is. So the Secretary of State say, we're opening up relations here with Azerbaijan because we think this is really good and they're fantastic. And the Pope has something he doesn't like about Azerbaijan. He could put his foot down. That would create a rift inside. You'd hear about it soon. In this day and age, it would be leaked out. There's no question about it. But everybody who operates at the Pope's discretion, who gets appointed by the Pope, and this government apparatus that runs in the Holy See, they understand that the power is sitting over with the pontiff, that person who's been selected as the vicar of Christ on earth, because I think of this back to my school days. That's what we think of. That's what Catholics think of the Pope as, the representative of Christ on earth. And, he's carrying a big stick. That stick is a lot of authority. You just don't get many who utilize it. As a matter of fact, in terms of history, for those who follow the Catholic Church, the last Pope who was what I call Pope with a capital P was all the way back in World War II, Pius XII. He was sort of the last grand Pope who really viewed the papacy as a stick to be used at all times. Other popes,
and correct me if I'm wrong, he's the one that created the Vatican Bank himself, isn't he?
Yeah, that's right. You had popes that some are more muscular than others, but they are aware, as you said before, popularity makes the conducive, worshipers in church and those who follow, they like a pope that they can like. So no one likes a pope who is behaving like an autocrat, even though there are few positions in the world that can be more autocratic.
So with all that power, with all the power that they have as, the top guy, what kind of, and this kind of leads back into what you were saying with the dark cloud that surrounds the Vatican Bank. What are they doing to increase transparency? Is there an actual policy that's being put into play to increase transparency and allow people to see what's going on?
Yeah. So they are, but they are doing it because they were forced to. They sort of did it kicking and screaming and protesting against it. And what I mean by that is, I don't think there'd be any reforms of the Vatican Bank or the finances today, even after Francis, if it hadn't been for this quirk of history that Europe decided to adopt the euro in the late 1990s, and Italy made a decision on its own. What do? Do we keep the Italian lira or do we go with the euro? They went with the euro. And that put the Vatican into a bind because the Vatican relied on the Italian lira as its currency. So the Vatican in 1999 and 2000 had to decide, do we go with and use the euro, even though we're not part of the EU, right? Or do we create our own currency? And the cardinals debated it and they decided to go with the euro. What they didn't realize then is once they decided to go with the common currency, the EU, even though they're not members of it, Brussels, from where the EU is based, gets the right to say that all of the countries and nations that use the euro have to have banking standards that use the internationally accepted code of banking and transparency. And they, from Brussels, send regulators out to your country to examine your central bank's records. And they put you on a list from A to sort of the blacklist. If you're on the blacklist, nobody wants to do business with you and you're shunted aside. So Liechtenstein was on the blacklist originally. And it took a person who later went over to the Vatican to get them off by making them transparent. The Vatican, when they realized that, there was this moment of panic inside some of the cardinals. They said, oh my God, what do we do? You mean European regulators are going to come down and look at the Vatican banks? Other parts of the government inside the Vatican never saw the books of the Vatican Bank. It's totally autonomous. So why would we show European regulators those books? And when they realized they had to, because they were still using the euro, it was too late to create anything else, they started to clean up their act. And the first real investigation by the regulators said the Vatican isn't an F. It's not a blacklist. It's in the middle. It's got a lot of things to clean up. It's got these accounts with dead people. It's got unknown bank transfers, all this stuff. But over time, Francis made sure that the bank got cleaner. They brought in these outside people, and the bank has gotten better because it had to be. And we finally know now, Tristan, I think you said before how much money the Vatican takes in a year or that. We discovered the size of the Vatican Bank. So no one knew until these regulators went in. It turns out it's about the size of a mid-sized community bank in America, $6 to $7 billion in assets. It's not JP Morgan. It's not, Chase Manhattan or that. So, but it's enough money to get in trouble. You understand if you're not doing things right. And so that's what cleaned it up. And key thing is that Francis decided he was going to redo the entire system in which they've made financial decisions over the years. So he created a directorate of the economy, sort of a new end of the bureaucracy. Like we created Department of Homeland Security after 9/11, right? They created this Department of the Economy, which would regulate and watch real estate investments and everything else. And he put into the charge of it an Australian cardinal, George Pell. And it looked like Pell would actually do good things, but then Pell got indicted for sex abuse decades earlier back in Australia, went back to Australia, was convicted of it, and then the decision was overturned. But that was the sort of the end of the director of the economy. It's never moved on since then.
Yeah, guilty or innocent, it's hard to move on from something like that, especially in anybody's eyes who wants you to do a certain job where it's the power of faith, I guess, is in your hands.
You're right. And look at, I have a chapter in the book. It's a quote from one of the lawsuits called "The Criminal Underground and the Priesthood." It's about the sexual, abuse cases that had been brought on against clergy, and I look at it, as you could imagine, since I'm looking at money from the money angle. What happened to the church, and you find out that the church operated as a business in the U.S. So that when the first cases were discovered and the first lawsuits were filed, they made sure that legally every diocese was its own corporate entity, sort of like a real estate developer. If a real estate developer is doing 10 different projects, they're all different corporations. If one goes under because it's in a bad area, they can't get the financing, it doesn't bring down this entire empire, right? So here, the church sort of made each one a silo. So if one turned out to have more lawsuits in that than another, they got in trouble, it wouldn't affect anybody else. And we've had 17 or 18, dioceses or parishes go into bankruptcy, but they're on their own as a result of that. $3 billion in terms of costs to the church, $2 billion in terms of settlements into like 2015 at the time I was writing the book, $1 billion more into cost for lawyers than that. The concern in the Vatican with the Pope, very interesting, was at first they thought it was a uniquely American problem. This is only a problem in America. And then they discovered, then cases started to come out in Germany and in Italy and other places. They realized, no, it was a larger problem. But the litigation problem was a U.S. thorn in the side. So what they worried about in Vatican City was some damn American lawyer, it's only a matter of time until they sue the Pope. They're going to say, you, the Pope, you're the supreme leader of the entire church. These people, the cardinals, the bishops, the monsignors, the priests in America are acting as your agents. So you are ultimately responsible. And they're going to try to tap into some of that great wealth, Tristan and Kip, back in the Vatican, right? So, and it took only a matter of time. The Pope was eventually named in a number of these suits. And the defense from the church was that I love this part because, and I'm a lawyer in another lifetime, so I like this defense. The church gets to play two different cards here. They have the church card, and then they have the sovereign country card. You cannot sue in an American court a foreign head of state. You usually can never break that. It's because we don't want them suing us, America, in their courts. So we sort of say, okay, you can't sue here. So the Vatican played the country card. It said we're a sovereign entity. The Pope is head of the Holy See, head of a country here. You can't sue him for what's taking place, and he had nothing to do with this. These are separate entities. The courts agreed. It went all the way up the Supreme Court. The Pope was never included in any of the suits, and that was the end of it. And in the Vatican, they just breathed a great sigh of relief. So if you look at this in terms of the money aspect, I mean, it's been a tremendous cost to the church, not just in reputational value, but in just strictly financial value. And I don't mean by that to minimize the impact on victims. I'm not saying that it's just a money issue. You understand? But I'm just saying that as somebody who did a book on money in the Vatican.
I love asking people this, and of course you're going to be no different. And obviously we've seen you have over a dozen books you've written, so many different topics. And I'm going to just be honest and blunt, would love to have you back sometime to talk about some of the other stuff. Because I mean, we could probably do about 5 of these with just on books that you've written. But from the Vatican alone, what's your favorite thing you've learned with all the research you've done? Like if it were just a party conversation, you're sitting around having drinks and you're like, this will blow your mind, or this is the fact that I love the most. What is it?
Oh, my favorite is the period in which the Vatican Bank is in what I call its cocaine cowboy days. So this is 70s and 80s. And it is just wild. You cannot, I mean, where the church is today versus where it was then is like night and day. And that's because the bankers who were running it as truly one of the great offshore banks. It was a offshore bank in the heart of Rome so that, and there are instances of this in which the Vatican Bank was unique. It accepted physical deposits. So you could come to it with gold, cash, whatever. So if you stood on a street corner, so with a suitcase full of $1 million in cash or $5 million in gold or diamonds, you were on a street corner in Italy, fine. You cross the street. If you put it into an Italian bank, it would become part of the record. The bank would report to the government, and the government would know you had that money. If you cross the street, there's an invisible barrier, and you're now technically in Vatican City. You give it to a cardinal who has a bank account. They open it up in your name. It goes into there, and it goes off the radar. Nobody knows about it. And that was so tempting for so many people that there's story after story. And one of my favorites is that
So it was like a religious version of an offshore account.
Yeah, that's exactly it. Was
it sounds like the greatest money laundering system ever created. Like,
well, it's fantastic because think of this. I mean, there's a former Italian prime minister. He's now passed away a few years ago, Andreotti. He was, I think, somebody will correct me if I'm wrong, 7 times prime minister, only in Italy, right? You have 60 governments after the war. So you become prime minister, then you're taken out, then you become prime minister. He was defense minister at different times. But one of the, if not the most powerful post-war politician, turns out that we discovered after his death that he had an account at the Vatican Bank, called the Cardinal Spellman Foundation. It didn't exist anywhere else in the world except in the Vatican Bank. There was no Cardinal Spellman Foundation outside of there. And he used that to pass through cash. It was like a slush fund, $63 million over time, that he used as payoffs to political allies and opponents. His wife used it to buy jewelry from a Florentine jeweler. I mean, it's a fantastic nest egg. And, people will say to me, so why would the Vatican allow this? What was the purpose of the Vatican allowing somebody like him to run that through? And I say, boy, that's the power of having the information. J. Edgar Hoover was running the FBI in the 60s. He used to gather all this information and files on everybody. Didn't always use it as blackmail, but he knew he could. The popes and the church like having the information about who's avoiding taxes and who's dirty and who's not paying this and who's got 6 girlfriends. They don't necessarily have to use it, but if somebody tries to tax the church, they may go to some of those politicians to get some votes in the Italian parliament. So it's a hardball game. And I could regale at any dinner party with some of those stories from what I call the bank's cocaine cowboy days.
It's all leverage. The church has leverage. The bank has leverage. And by extension, the church has leverage over politicians and world leaders. And that's wild.
And as a result, you're never going to get the Italian government to do a crackdown on the church in terms of finances or taxing properties or whatever else, because so many of them are in bed with the church on things that they don't want revealed. So it really was a symbiotic relationship. But it's not as much fun as it is today because it has cleaned up, and those politicians, for the most part, have closed their accounts. It's no longer so easy to open up an account at the Vatican Bank.
And you were right, for the record. It is 7 times over various periods during the 60s and up to the early 90s.
Boy, it's hard to imagine. Not hard to imagine that I sort of remember that somewhere in the recess of my brain, because my wife would tell you I leave my glasses on a table. I leave my phone 4 times during the day when I'm walking out. I forget the stuff right in front of me, but somewhere in the back of my mind, I'm good with the facts and figures to the exclusion of the practical things in the day.
Don't feel bad. I stood up from my desk where my phone was sitting next to me earlier today and walked into the other room to ask Kip where my phone was.
Yeah.
Yeah. So before we go to our questionnaire at the end, sir, why don't you tell everybody where they can find you on social media and your books?
So as my publishers like to say, you can find the books in every place where good books are sold, although that seems to be a diminishing number of bookstores all the time. So if you have a bookstore nearby, it might be there, but otherwise on all the digital platforms like Amazon or iBook, Apple Books, and others, Barnes & Noble. And on social media, I have a Substack called Just the Facts with Gerald Posner, in which I publish articles on different items. And on Twitter, I have a sort of a sort of a loud voice on different matters that have my interest at the time. And there I'm just at Gerald Posner.
And just for the record, anybody who's listening, go into a bookstore, and if they don't have it, ask them to order it for you.
Yeah,
physical media is so much better. Stan Lee said it best, you know. Comic books are like, well, forgive my rudeness if your wife's still in the room. Comic books are like boobs. They're nice to look at in a magazine, but you want to hold one in your hand.
I never remember the Stan Lee item. I'll have to remember that. You know, and by the way, one thing, when you say go into a bookstore and order a book, there are a few more humbling experiences in being an author. And you go into a bookstore in the early days, you know, your first book is published, your second book, and you think, boy, it's going to be a window full of books. And then you sort of are looking around for it. You really don't want to ask anybody. You figure I'll find it myself. So my first book's this biography on the Nazi Dr. Joseph Mengele. I'm looking in history. Maybe it's World War II. Maybe it's world history. Maybe it's biographies. And then finally, I'm with my wife and we say, okay, let's go ask somebody. So you go and you say to somebody, and, you know, you have this book on Mengele. Who are the authors? Gerald Posner and John Ware. Could you spell that name? Okay, let's look here. What's that name again? Was it 2 S's? No, 1 S. No, we can order it for you. So let me tell you, you know, go in and ask them to order a book if you want to. But if you're the author, you should know that not everybody is J.K. Rowling or, James Patterson.
In the middle of ordering it, he accidentally drops his ID on the counter. Oh my, look at that. Oops. Gerald Posner. Check that.
I did have once, last thing, once on, we'd go into bookstores, you'd sign the books that are there, your stock, and so they'd give them a better placement. And on my second book, which was about the Chinese mafia and the heroin trade, went into a bookstore in Manhattan, and the clerk behind the counter, even though I had an author photo in there, said, "Can I see ID?" And I thought to myself, wow, you mean to tell me that there are people going around and signing books that they aren't the authors of in New York City? And if I was going to do that, I might sign Norman Mailer's book as opposed to just my book, you know. So I thought that was pretty fantastic.
At that point, all you got to do is pick the book up and turn it around.
Yeah, that's right.
Pick the book up, turn it around, and say, "There's my ID."
That's right.
That was my mistake. I was going in and autographing other people's books.
My wife just said she became an expert at moving books around. It's true that we could tell in New York City when we used to live there that an author had been to the store before us, because you'd go into a section and their 4 copies of the book were all facing front at the top of the thing. I'd have to put my copies over those. That's right. And then some author, because a lot of authors live in New York, I'm sure was in 20 minutes later and put their book over that.
Oh yeah. Well, we like to end everything with a questionnaire made famous by Bernard Pivot and Mr. James Lipton, because you know we're not very good podcasters. So when you don't know how to end it, you steal from someone who's already done it really well. So Kip.
Yep. All right. What is your favorite word?
My favorite word is conundrum.
What is your least favorite word?
Genius.
What sound or noise do you love?
Rain.
What
Heavy
sound
rain.
or noise? What sound or noise do you hate?
Silence.
What profession other than your own would you like to attempt?
It's hard. Sorry to be so stuck on that, because it's hard for me to imagine. I left a profession I didn't like as much to do this. I sort of love doing this. I'm afraid that somebody's going to come and tell me that I have to get a real job at some point. I'm paying my bills by doing this. I sort of like it so much. So I'm not sure there's an answer to that. Put it this way. I'm not sure of what I would do, but I know I would do something outside of a large organization. I couldn't work for somebody at this point. It would have to be on my own.
Okay. What profession other than your own would you not like to attempt?
Law. Go back to law.
I saw that coming. Creatively, what turns you on?
Oh, research. Unquestionably, no doubt. That's the greatest phase of doing work, is discovering new things, getting into the archives. Thank God it's not all digitized. You have to do real work. You have to go to the physical archives of places that are in the middle of nowhere and take out boxes and put on the gloves so you don't hurt the original documents, and look through the files, and you find some nugget of information that nobody has seen before, they haven't put together because they haven't made the connections. That's fantastic.
It makes you feel like Indiana Jones in a way, doesn't it?
I never thought of that, but I'll have to, if I have my Indiana Jones hat on next time I do it, I might even feel better about it.
Creatively, what turns you off?
Having to promote the book that you've written, if that makes sense. Now, I don't mean to say I'm lucky to be able to do that. I'm happy to have the interviews and everything else. But as you can imagine, most of it, if the larger the show or the outlet, they give you 5 minutes or 6 minutes. And the first question is, what's new? And if you don't have an exciting what's new, if I say on the finance of the Vatican, what's new is the church was doing business with the Nazis and the Italian fascists in World War II, they sort of go, oh, that's interesting. What's new today? Did Francis do anything scandalous in the last hour or two? So it's just the process. It's all right. You get used to it, but it's my least favorite.
Okay, this is Tristan's favorite question in this entire in the entire questionnaire here. What is your favorite curse word?
Oh, it's not really a curse word, but it's one that I picked up from my wife, who's British, and I refer to people sometimes as wankers.
I like that.
And because it's so non-American, if you get into a real heated discussion with someone and you say you wanker, they're taken back. They say, what? Is that a compliment? Is that an insult? Sorry.
It's not a curse word, but one of my favorite things is to call someone a dunce.
Yeah, it's not a curse word. You're right.
Yeah. I feel like it just carries so much more gravity to it, though.
And this one here, this is my personal favorite question to ask people. If heaven exists, what would you like to hear God say when you arrive at the pearly gates?
Oh, for me, Oswald did do it alone. You wrote a good book.
I like that. I like that.